Awesome. So what we're here for today is to talk about the scope, the different expectations, and the kind of stuff we want to tackle in this KR, and to make sure that we are all aligned. I'm going to share my screen so that you can all see the agenda that I have attached to this meeting. And I have linked the official KR issue to this so that everyone can come back to this one as the single source of truth. But what I would love to talk about today is, first of all, the scope, then talk about the potential steps that we're all together going to take, a potential timeline, and any potential other questions in the end. But I want to kick us off with any questions before, any comments, anything we should add to this agenda, anything where, before we dive into the scope, we should already talk about something else. Nope,
I want to thank Marcel for setting this up, and Ian for taking the lead here, Jeremy for helping us out, and also Amy for being here. I'm really happy that we're all here talking about this, and that we feel the shared responsibility of working in this area. So yeah, I just wanted to set it off with a good tone.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And this is exactly what I also should have said and what I wanted to say, because this might really be one of the first really cross-stage, very large collaborative efforts that we're going to have. So I hope we're going to have more and more of these, but this one is going to be a great case for why these are important. I would like to kick us off with the scope, because this is something that has come up in a lot of questions, and I want to make sure we are all aligned on this and that everyone who watches this video also is aligned. When we worked on the async design critique for the merge requests, one thing that really stood out was that there's such a large variety in the designs of all of these merge request widgets. We have the merge request widgets for branch, pipelines, approvers, merge trains, and then all of the merge request widgets from other groups like Terraform, code quality, metrics, security, test summary, license compliance, browser performance tests, and the security scan. In this KR, we really want to focus only on the right side of this. So we are not going to focus on the merge widget, not on the approvers widget, not on the pipelines widget. We want to focus on the ones that are very similar in the kind of content they contain, very similar in the kind of current design. And we just thought it would be too much trying to tackle like the approvers widget, just because it's also a merge request widget. It's a bit of a different content than looking at, for example, code quality and metrics. So we only want to focus on these merge request widgets instead of these ones. Does that make sense? Any questions so far?
Will you separate those out in the file just so we have some delineation?
For sure. I also already separated them out on the KR itself. If you expand the details here, you can see that we have the ones highlighted that we want to focus on. And we have also set these as exceptions that we are not going to work on. And I want to look at some of the aspects that we thought were problems when we worked on the async design critique. And these are the focus points of what we would like to improve in this OKR. When we're looking at, for example, the iconography, we have very interesting patterns here. We use this black exclamation mark for communicating almost anything. In this case, it's 3 Terraform reports were generated in your pipelines, and 1 report failed to generate. This is exactly the same icon as we use, for example, in security scanning, when you have detected vulnerabilities. That sounds like different severity and a different problem to me, to the user. And so we want to be clearer in what do these icons actually mean. We are also using this green checkmark icon for here, saying there are no new vulnerabilities, when we have no changed test results, when we have no new licenses. But you can see that it's getting really, really interesting with the black exclamation mark, especially because when we look at, for example, the metrics reports, we say it changed on 66 points. We have no clue whether this is positive, neutral, negative, but the exclamation mark has a very negative connotation. And this is one of the problems with the iconography. Another one I would like to point out is that we are using here a dash, and also in a couple of other spots, like on license compliance, to visualize something. We haven't really figured out what that dash is supposed to mean, if it's just a bullet point, if it's something else. It's no clear, and we want to make that clearer, especially because it's being put into comparison to something like an X, and it's not clear really what it's supposed to communicate. Let me go back to the agenda. The wording, and this is probably where Amy is going to have a lot of fun with, but we believe that there's quite a lot of opportunities for improvement in the wording of these areas. I already pointed out some things like metrics report changed on 66 points. What does that mean to the user? I don't know whether our users can really make sense of it. I can't. We have things like this: contained no change test results out of 123,000 total tests. Then we have found no changed test results out of total tests. So even inside these different small widgets, there's inconsistency between just one widget. We have very interesting details here. We have, for example, license compliance detected 19 licenses for the source branch only. And this small addition of for the source branch only is incredibly important for the user, because this means that this information is suddenly not about what change does this merge request bring into the product, but it just checks the source branch. It's a very different pattern to what we are seeing before, and especially important, for example, when we're looking at security scanning. When you say security scanning detected no new vulnerabilities, it's a very positive thing, because you know that it's no difference between the source branch and the target branch. But when a test can only run over the source branch for some reason, it's a very different kind of information that we can actually give to the user. And our assumption is that this is not as easily understood by the user as we currently assume it is, by just adding for the source branch only. We also have error states, and I kind of have pointed them out before already. When we have, for example, on the security scanning merge request widget, we have an error state that says security scanning detected no new vulnerabilities, but it's actually errors when loading results. So if there's an error when loading the results, can it actually detect any new vulnerabilities? Should we state it like this? In other cases, we have failed to load code climate report. So there's a bunch of different errors that currently we believe are not consistent, not consistently handled. And also, again, coming back to the iconography, if we cannot load the code climate report, like, why do we communicate a black exclamation mark with the same severity as the 20 new vulnerabilities to the user? Is that really the same kind of message that we want to give? That's something where we feel like our error states should be better. Our current collapse expand pattern is very interesting. And I'm saying this in a not so positive way. I can see whether I can quickly bring up one merge request to just show what it looks like in the product when you have all of these widgets below each other. Here it actually right now is still okay because it's still loading. But you see that you have a ton of just button below button below button below button. And when you then expand these, I should have found one that has a lot of content because it pushes everything else further below, and it's not even so clear anymore what belongs to what. Like as soon as we have this expanded, you see everything becomes so much more complex. So we would love to go ahead.
Yes, yeah. Marcel, if in the agenda, if you visit the link that I added there for a recent proposal, there's me, Chayana, and Becca worked on improving this a little bit. So this is what it looked like before. And as you showed in that merge request on gitlab.com right now, there are still widgets that don't have any indentation, for example. And so in this issue, we added that indentation, and you can already see that in the security scanning widget, that the SAST and dependency scanning are indented. And we also applied that to the test summary. And you can see here, the 3 levels are now much clearer than what it was before. It's not perfect, and there's some inconsistencies here and there. But this hasn't been applied to the other widgets, and it would be good to see everything in context, because here we were just solving this specific problem with a scalpel, basically.
Yeah. And as you can also see here again, one of the problems of our iconography, different sizes that pushes content into different distances from the icon. One interesting other piece, it's more problematic on the pipeline widget itself, but some of the icons we are using are actually the icons we have from the pipeline, so that you have this icon here, this icon here. This one is clickable. This one is also, but it brings you to a completely different spot. And then when you click the same icon down here, nothing happens. So we need to become better in differentiating these ones.
That's for power users, Marcel.
Yeah.
That other link.
Yeah, I also just figured out for the first time that we have even there a link, which is interesting. And yeah, as you can see here, we already now have also specific widgets introducing new kind of content in this area. We have certain widgets including already information that would otherwise only be visible in the expanded section in this view. And we should look at making this consistent if we want to establish this as a pattern. We also have this wonderful view full report button here that takes up a lot of space. And this together with the expand button can lead to a complete overload of buttons in this area. And yeah, one piece that I mentioned a few times, importance of information. We currently overload the user with information in this area, and we overload them with so much different kind of content, and we don't give them a clear priority on what's actually important. We have the same patterns for security scanning, where you can actually bring in new securities into the code base, versus metrics reports that are changing, and where it's absolutely not clear whether that's even a negative thing or a positive thing. So we need to become better in communicating clearly what is important and making it easier for the user to understand why it is. So these are the aspects that we think would be great to focus on. There's also ongoing research about how users understand these widgets, how they interact with them. We are trying to improve the amount of data we currently have for them. And we want to look at long-term as well, but also looking at where do they even fit into the user's workflow. But this is a bit separate from what we want to focus on here. We believe that it's better to still focus on these merge request widgets in the current state right now and improve them while doing the very long-term outlook, and make sure that all of these things are going to be easier to understand, are going to be fixed, while we try to see, for example, with the security team, they are thinking about moving their widget into a tab. Is that a good idea or not? These are things we want to solve outside of this OKR. And we rather want to focus on, if we keep the widgets in kind of the current state as they are, how can we improve them?
Yeah, I think one thing worth highlighting is that, especially when we start looking at the wording, and you, for example, Marcel, you mentioned the changes in this MR versus source branch only, and even like looking here at the metric reports, it says changed on 74 points. And the designers in us, and also as users, we will try to understand, like, does this information make sense? Like, is this what we should be presenting here? And I think that that is worthwhile, but I don't think it should be part of this work here. I think it would be preferable to highlight those issues, like, is this the right information that we should display here? Can we show something else? So I think it's more about working with what we have at the moment, the content that is shown, and how we can make it more understandable and easier to digest when reading and when scanning the widgets, and not so much how we can change the functionality to be more helpful. Because I think that would increase the scope of the work, and we would have to do even more validation, and it would put a big burden on the groups that own these things. And as Marcel mentioned, we're doing that research that would potentially reshape all of the widgets as we know them. And so, yeah, it's more at this level, it's more working with the tool, the material that we have here, if that makes sense.
And it's absolutely possible that because this area of the UI is being highlighted as part of this effort, different teams will go in and investigate their own content maybe more deeply. That would be an amazing outcome, but that should be more on these groups themselves. And that's why we need to pull them into the effort as well, as part of this general conversation. So this concludes the first aspect of scope. Any questions, any comments on this area so far? Awesome. Sounds like everything's clear. Next point I would love to go at is potential steps we could take. The first one is, I think, very similar to what Pedro did previously on the async design critique for merge requests as a larger thing. We could do an audit of the merge request widgets we want to focus on. We have taken a first step, and there is quite a lot of content already in this async design critique, but I'm not sure if these are all the states, if these are all the UI that these widgets can contain. And so we can try to gather them all in one Figma file and bring in the different teams to discuss whether this is everything that they also have as states, and make sure we really gather every single state so that we know what's in these widgets. After that is done, I think this is really where it then becomes interesting, and where we all can collaborate on how do we want to improve this. I don't have a clear view already for how this is going to go down. I think this is very much up to you all, how you all want to shape this. But next step would probably be some way of creating new explorations, looking at how to improve this, fixing all the small details we point out as comments in the widgets, some area of this. I'm gonna wait until Pedro has finished typing. Is that also the kind of flow that you would have expected for this first part before we bring in the other groups? And this is directed to everybody.
It does make sense to me that one of our first steps should be a full audit. And I think that's the perfect way to introduce the groups and get them to identify who should be doing that kind of work. Because my next point kind of addresses that as well. So having the other designers come in and say, these are all of the dates for this secure widget. This is even the ones we have in the pipeline, or they have the context that we don't in order to make that. So it makes sense to do the first step of having them included in a Figma file. What I would like to do, and this is the next point, is also create some sort of way to identify that they are the DRI for this. That way, for the rest of the quarter, it's very clear that designer X is in charge of this widget and they're responsible, and they need to communicate with Jeremy and Amy and me and everyone in the team and set that up first early in the KR. That way we can use the rest of it to actually implement the visual standards, the writing standards, etc., without having to shuffle at the end who is the one who actually has to do this. Does that resonate with anybody else?
I think that's a great idea.
Yep.
And I think
yeah,
the general. Go ahead.
I just said confirming. Yeah, I prefer an audit with the dry.
And what I think the general pattern we could follow, or we should follow here, is very much what Amy already set down for her own work. Is we as the larger team want to determine a pattern. For her, it's for all the messages. For us, it's about the entire design for everything that's displayed in a widget or area. Document it, create a framework around this, similar to how Pedro has done it on the merge widget. And then bring in the other teams to really take that, put it into their own widget, make sure everything works. And if really aspects like this come up, something about my widget is special and we shouldn't follow the pattern, we should have something very different, we need to have a discussion around this, how we can make it fit the pattern, either by updating it or by saying, all right, this is a use case that's just a one-off. We will see how we're going to deal with this. How do you all feel about this general approach? Cool, sounds good. So that brings me to the timeline, and I don't have clear due dates in my head for any of this. We know we have 1 quarter to make this happen until we come out with designs for each of the widgets. So the 2 things we want to have is the design and documentation of a merge request widgets framework. And I put this just here so that we have some date written down here. This, if we want to change this, we can absolutely. We still have 1 week until the OKR starts. But I just took like half the time. We're going to work on creating this framework, creating the patterns, and having this basically ready by 15th of June, which would leave us the other half of the quarter to align with the teams on their affected widgets and create, adapt their widget on this framework and create the updated UI. so that in Q3, each of these teams can go in and actually implement the new design for their merge request widget. Any other suggestions than 15th of June, or should we just keep this open and see what we want to come out with when the OKR starts?
I think that's good. I would wonder, will there be any kind of freeze on activity for these widgets? Like what if, this is a significant time frame, if any other features or items are introduced in this time block, how will we be aware of it and account for it?
So what I would suggest is we already have a Slack channel for merge request widgets that was set up for a similar effort a longer time ago. I think it was about 6 months, 9 months, somewhere around this. What we should make sure is that we bring in the DRI for each area into that Slack channel and alert us of any work they do on their own widgets and any potential updates. When we start with the audit, we're probably also going to have a call with these different team members, and we're going to ask them, is there anything current in flight? And so we want to be sure that we check that at the beginning and that they inform us in the Slack channel if anything comes in during the milestone. Sounds good? Perfect. Amy, you put in a comment here. Do you want to vocalize this one? Because I didn't read it yet.
Yeah, that's okay. You pulled up my comment in the issue, which addresses most of it. That I think I would be better used setting up patterns instead of trying to eat the entire elephant by myself, because turns out I need to sleep. It's terrible. One concern that I would have, which Pedro has seen a bit of, is that changes to messages almost always require a front-end engineer. So what looks like just a documentation change or just a wording change, we tend to have to lean on other teams. So making sure that they're resourced properly would be good here.
Makes sense. Yep. When the OKR starts, I'm also gonna ask every team member who has a merge widget to already inform their PM that this is current work that's ongoing, and potentially even somewhere share this in the development of front-end channel so that they are already aware this might be coming. So that brings us to number 4. Jeremy, do you want to put on your first question?
Yeah, just in regards to scope, consideration for responsive, just generally, just so we know how much effort we need to spend towards layout and reflow.
Pedro, you had the first comment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I think we should do that. But if it's something that we feel could be a lot of effort, it might be preferable just for us to prioritize the desktop experience and have a slightly better experience for smaller viewports. But yeah, I think that's one of the things I wanted to, yeah, this, as Marcel is showing, like today it's awful. But even in not so small viewports, the lines that start wrapping, they don't wrap really well. And it also impairs the way that people read the text. So I think we should consider it, but yeah, with a grain of salt regarding the effort it might take for us to implement something that works perfectly on smaller viewports, because we don't know how soon it would be until we change the way all of the widgets work. So yeah, I think that's a good question and a good consideration to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fair, and I think, yeah, layout wise, I'm gonna aim for that probably 100% of the time just by default, but even considering, you know, use case on mobile, should they always be collapsed by default, et cetera? You know, there might be content that we reflow differently or put in the collapse. So that type of maybe thinking more at it as a one-to-one experience rather than tailoring it towards a smaller viewport. So next question, I know that these are only a subset of widgets, so I want to make sure that we aren't introducing any patterns or anything here that is going to negatively impact future work on other widgets later or be completely incompatible. So just wanted to know if there should be any time spent just as a high-level audit to validate any changes that we make, ensuring that they would, in general, to the best of our knowledge, holistically apply to the other widgets in the future.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely valid. As we can see, especially with like padding margin, it could be very easily that any updates to how these are how layout works here, it might impact these ones as well. I think this is really where Pedro, as you know the merge request page probably the best in the entire design team, you can take the lead on making us aware if there are any changes that impact the other widgets, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think any change that we make will probably impact the other widgets. But I think it's the same thing as the responsive. Right now, we're prioritizing the ones that have been listed in that issue. So if we have to make trade-offs, we will always make them to the benefit of those widgets. But we can always, as you also said, Jeremy, we can always raise the flag and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. It would be great for these widgets. But if we do that, it would also affect, for example, the approvals widget or the request to merge widget. And that's perfectly fine. And we can then create issues to address those later. We just don't want at this time to put too much pressure on the code review group to implement those changes. But thinking holistically, yes, prioritizing those widgets first, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I think that's great. And if we're documenting that, then I think that will help as well. So good. I think we're at time, aren't we? But the last question really quick it's just consideration for hierarchy and grouping. So we're wanting these to be more consumable and we're looking at them kind of as individual units, but is there any thought given towards hierarchy and grouping that would help make the content more meaningful, have larger collapse grouping sections, et cetera, other, things like that, attributes, affordances that would make the consuming these widgets easier and keep them more standard?
I think that's a great question. And I think this might actually be one of the insights that when we do the audit, we can absolutely come out with, saying that we might need to do this. Pedro, have you already thought about this, maybe also in the context of merge checks?
I'm trying to see if I understood Jeremy's question correctly. Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, it seems like there's no perceived, at least from my perspective, hierarchy or relationship between these. It's just individual line items. But let's say there's a ton of things that are maybe vulnerabilities or high impact. Would we ever say, those should be grouped, and in that we can add extra messaging to make it more clear that, to Marcel's point earlier with metrics changed on 74 points, is that good or bad? If we had here's a good section, or here's a bad section, or here's everything related to failures, things like that we could do, to contextualize these, to group them, to make them more scannable, as well as allow messaging to serve multiple widgets rather than just trying to one up, ideas like that.
Yeah, I think those are very valid. And if we have those ideas and we think that they have merit, I think we should raise and create issues for them so that we don't forget about them. But to my knowledge, we don't have that information today, and it would require more implementation efforts to, for example, reorder them like that. So yeah, create issues for those things, but that wouldn't be the priority because we would have to change the behavior. But I like that idea of changing that because, for example, of the ones here, only security scanning and license compliance can block the merge. Like everything else, even like tests fail, metrics fail, quality fails, you can still merge. There's no first class way of blocking the merge with that, but security scanning and license compliance, that exists. So we could, for example, highlight those widgets and say, here is the information that you need to unblock the merge. But yeah, as I said, we don't have any information today, but I think it's a wonderful idea, and we should record those ideas as we go along, because it might help inform future developments, not only in the short term, but then when we have the research done about how these widgets are being consumed, we can then rethink those widgets in a more holistic way, in a more scalable way, and that could be part of it. So, yeah.
Awesome. We're already above time, so I'm going to cut us off here. Let me quickly stop recording.